Welcome. We're going to have the planning board from Chatham open the meeting for them because they have a quorum. If anyone else has a quorum yet, we can have them open theirs as well. They're going to do a roll call and then we'll get into the meeting.
No.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning. My name is Art Spurrow. I'm chair of the planning board. I'd like to open this planning board meeting and do a roll call vote. Bob Wershafter. Here. Charlene Greenwald.
Here.
Warren Chang. Here. And Art Spurrow here. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Good morning and welcome. I'm Catherine Ricks. I'm the Coastal Resilience Director with the Town of Chatham. I'd like to welcome you to today's workshop. This is the first Coastal Resilience Regulations and Bylaws Revision Workshop, which is intended to present information on the Cape Cod Commission's draft regulations and bylaws, including proposed updates to wetland regulations, wetland bylaws, and zoning bylaws. We are looking for a discussion on how to update the different town wetland regulations, wetland bylaws, and zoning bylaws in each of the Pleasant Bay towns, to keep all in alignment and have the revisions moving forward with a regional approach. The Cape Cod Commission, in collaboration with the Cooperative Extension, Hui Sea Grant, and other partners, developed the draft regulations, updates, wetland bylaws, and zoning bylaws using updated flood risk models. In parallel, the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection is in the process of updating the State Wetland Protection Act regulations, including the addition of performance standards for the land subject to coastal storm flowage. Chatham applied and was awarded a Southeast New England Grant Program, or SNEP program, technical assistance grant for fiscal year 26. The grant provides the town with access to SNEP partner technical assistance to support development of coastal resilience regulations. The Cape Cod Commission is the technical assistance partner under the SNEP grant. Building on that opportunity, Chatham reached out to Pleasant Bay Alliance and to explore a regional approach, working together to help align local communities and move forward in the coastal resilience in a coordinated effort. Today we will have 3 speakers doing a presentation before we get into any discussion. The speakers are Heather McElroy, who is with the Cape Cod Commission. She's the Natural Resource Program Manager at the Cape Cod Commission. She's a planner who works with Cape communities to advance natural resource protection and improve coastal resiliency. Shannon Hulst is Floodplain Specialist and Deputy Director at Barnstable County's Cape Cod Cooperative Extension and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute Sea Grant, as well as a member of the Dennis Conservation Commission. She provides floodplain-related technical assistance to help communities improve flood safety and coastal resilience. Carol Ridley is a principal of Ridley & Associates, a firm specializing in sustainable energy and environmental programs with emphasis on coastal resource management and restoration. She serves as the coordinator of the Pleasant Bay Alliance. So with that, I'd like to welcome Carol, Shannon, and Heather.
Excuse me, are the lights going to be dimmed at all? Better see the screen? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. So thanks everyone for coming. Really excited to see a great turnout here. Maybe just a show of hands to understand sort of our composition generally. Who all is from Chatham? Okay, and Chatham Conservation and Chatham Planning? Okay, great. Who's from Harwich? Great. Harwich Conservation? Harwich Planning? Okay, great. Folks from Orleans? Great. Orleans Conservation? And Orleans Planning? Okay. And some other Orleans. Great. Awesome. Anyone from Brewster? Okay. Hopefully we'll bring them in a little bit later, but that's good. Anyone else? I think I caught everyone. So we're gonna talk at you for a little bit, and hopefully this won't be too complicated as an introduction. Then we will pause to answer your questions and get into the details, and then hopefully have a little bit of a discussion about what we're about here and how we can all move forward with better regulating our floodplains. So yeah, this is a project that has had multiple phases. We're going to be talking about some model regulations that we have developed, as Catherine Ricks introduced. The partners on the top are working to bring this information to you, and the funding for this work has been provided by the SNEP network. So just a little bit of an overview of sort of why this matters. Here we are, Cape Cod. We have over 586 miles of vulnerable tidal shoreline, which I think you are all aware. We're very vulnerable to flooding and erosion at the present time. We know that climate change is bringing stronger storms and more erosion, and sea level rise is just going to exacerbate the effects of those coastal hazards. 19% of Cape Cod is located within a flood hazard area. That's 19% today, not thinking about future flooding. And 30% of town identified critical facilities are actually located in those flood hazard areas. So if you're not aware, almost all of our towns go through a hazard mitigation planning process to make them eligible for FEMA funding. And one of the things to identify are critical facilities. So that's these numbers are getting at that. We've estimated, the Cape Cod Commission has estimated that there's $46 billion worth of total assessed value within the FEMA floodplain across the Cape. That's a lot of value. And bringing that sort of into focus for this group, which is targeted at the 4 communities around around Pleasant Bay, that's $10.2 billion in just assessed property values. And as you're all likely aware, assessed values don't entirely reflect actual market value. So we wanted to just drill in a little bit more on what we're looking at in each community. The illustrations here are they're from a map viewer that we'll introduce to you in a little bit. They don't capture the entire community, and they don't entirely represent the figures on the screen, but I'll explain. So here we are looking at parts of Harwich, and those dark blue or the opaque blue areas represent the FEMA flood hazard area. And within that area in Harwich, there are 1,962 parcels and over 1,000 structures with $2.9 billion in assessed value. In Chatham, again, just a section of Chatham, but overall town-wide, there are 1,837 parcels, 577 structures within that flood hazard area, also with a total assessed value of $2.9 billion. And then in Orleans, there are 1,620 parcels, 395 structures, and an assessed value of $2.5 billion. And you can see the extent in these images of the flooding. And then I also have a slide for Brewster. You can take a quick look at that, but we won't spend much time on that. So, as noted, we know sea level is rising. These are some of the projections around how quickly sea level will continue to rise. It's been rising for over a century in sort of a noticeable way, but we anticipate 2 feet of additional sea level rise by 2050 and 3.5 feet by 2070. I think that's actually a more modest projection than some that may be more realistic. So why should we care about regulating development in the floodplain? There are many community benefits to taking action to regulate development. So we have to acknowledge that our weather is changing, storms are more intense. Together with sea level rise, there's going to be more wind-driven flooding and storms with a real erosive effect on our shorelines. We have a responsibility to ensure that new development, as it is proposed, as it comes before our boards, is permitted and built to be as resilient as possible. So there are benefits to protecting properties, and not just those ones that are the ones that might get damaged during a storm, broken apart by those erosive waves, or flooded due to the storm inundation. But those storms carry the debris inland, the materials that are mobilized by the storm waters inland to other properties, and have much greater effects beyond the immediate areas of impact. So similarly, there's a huge benefit to protecting our environment. If we're doing more to regulate how development occurs and where it occurs, we do a better job of protecting the environment, which actually helps protect us from these storms. There's also a huge benefit in protecting emergency responders. The more that we can do to reduce having people in harm's way, then there's less demand on emergency responders to have to rescue people in bad situations. Over the long term, there's a reduction in infrastructure and repair costs that are felt and borne by the entire community, and there's reduced costs for storm response and cleanup, which we haven't really had to address that in a meaningful way here on Cape Cod in a very long time, and I think it's going to be shocking when it happens. So flood protection is a protected interest. I think those members of conservation commissions are aware that the Mass Wetlands Protection Act identifies land subject to coastal storm flowage as one of those coastal resource areas that can be regulated under the Mass Wetlands Protection Act. This is area that is subject to any inundation caused by coastal storm, up to and including that caused by the 100-year storm, surge of record, or storm of record, whichever is greater. But to date, there are few performance standards that address flood protection, and furthermore, at the present time, flood regulations address that flood area identified by FEMA, which is based on historic storms. It doesn't anticipate the impacts of future flooding that we know will extend further into our communities and have greater elevation because of changing sea levels and storminess. So the conservation commissions will also be aware that the state has issued draft regulations to address development in land subject to coastal storm flowage. These draft regulations are something that have been under consideration and in some form for decades. The state actually moved forward with putting a draft out for comment a couple of years ago now. They took comment, of which there was much, and they are working on making modifications. The question is, when will they promulgate those regulations? Somewhat unknown, but there are a number of indicators that the state is actually moving forward with promulgating regulations on this topic in the near future. That said, we're not going to hold our breath, but I want you all to understand that when Cape Cod Commission and Cooperative Extension, Hui C grant, worked on developing the regulations that we're going to share with you next. We were aware that the state was developing regulations, and our project team worked closely with DEP to align these model regulations we've developed with those state regulations. So our model enables us to do more than the state regulations will, and of course we don't know what the state will actually promulgate, but we feel confident that we can move forward with doing something in our communities that will be meaningful to allow us to regulate development in the floodplain that won't be in conflict with these DEP regulations if or when they are promulgated. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Carol Ridley, who's going to give a little bit more context.
Thank you, Heather, and good morning, everyone. My name is Carol Ridley, coordinator for the Pleasant Bay Alliance. And I'll just provide a little bit of context about why our organization is involved with this effort. First, to introduce you to the Pleasant Bay Alliance if you're not familiar. So the Alliance is actually a municipal entity. It's formed by the 4 towns that share part of Pleasant Bay and the Pleasant Bay watershed. So, so we are actually an agent of the municipalities. And we provide sort of facilitation and coordination around resource management issues, a range of resource management issues affecting Pleasant Bay waters, but also the watershed of Pleasant Bay. So very active in issues such as wastewater planning that the towns are involved with. And for some time, we have been focused on this question of resilience from the perspective of understanding implications for shoreline resources and the built environment along the shoreline, as well as the estuarine function, so the ecological values and functions of Pleasant Bay as an estuary. And we've undertaken a number of studies over the years to really get a handle on what the potential impacts of climate change would be in and around Pleasant Bay. We issued erosion management guidelines some years ago. Some of you may be familiar with that document. And we, with funding from the State Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Act, we were fortunate to develop a 2-year process to develop a climate adaptation action plan. And that action plan really looked at assessing climate impacts, everything from looking at the vulnerability of the barrier beach, which protects Pleasant Bay, assessing impacts to infrastructure along the shoreline. So we think of roads, of course. We also have a number of public access points, public landings, the way we reach the water. We also look closely at stormwater infrastructure, water mains, wastewater infrastructure, pumping stations that are being installed for wastewater treatment to see how those could be affected. And we looked at what could happen due to climate change to some of our intertidal resources and found over time that we could lose a lot of them. So we had a rather wide-ranging set of recommendations that came out of this assessment, including this effort, which is to work collectively as 4 towns, and we're so thrilled to be working with all of you and the Cape Cod Commission and the Extension Service and Hui C grant through this network here, to assess the regulatory tools that are available, recognizing that it's not going to be a one easy fix here. We've got to look at all of the different ways we can plan in a smart manner and regulate in a smart manner to offer the best opportunities for resilience of infrastructure, including also private property. So that's how we sort of got into this effort. And although we're talking a lot about Pleasant Bay, we recognize, and I think an added benefit of this effort is that whatever comes out of this conversation and whatever the towns deem workable and reasonable to pursue in the way of regulatory changes could apply town-wide. So the benefits would not only be to your shorelines of Pleasant Bay or the floodplain in Pleasant Bay area, but also other areas of town. And just as a starting point, certainly we live in a set of communities. Our 4 towns have very rigorous regulations for land use and for wetland resource protection, for which we are very grateful, and all of the work you do to administer those regulations. We took a look at what our starting point is for this effort, and it's not ground zero. I mean, certainly, all 4 towns have, measures in place to regulate the floodplain to one degree or another. We have 2 towns that have wetland resource performance standards for land subject to coastal storm flowage. All 4 towns have some form of floodplain bylaw, although I believe only one goes beyond the minimum required by law. And none of the towns have yet, of course, adopted a coastal resilience district that reflects the new science we have available to us about sea level rise and storm surge. So we have a good foundation to work from, to build from. And so I think at this point I'm gonna turn it over to Shannon, I think, who's gonna walk us through the particulars of these regulatory tools that we wanna continue to discuss with you.
Great, thanks, Carol. So what we want to do next is lay the groundwork for our future work moving forward. We want to give you enough of a foundation here on what we've developed so that you understand that framework, but we're going to get into a lot of the details in future meetings. We just want to have enough information at this point that you understand kind of where we're coming from here. So we've created 3 products. We have a coastal resiliency bylaw that is part of the wetlands and goes with the Conservation Commission. It goes into your wetlands bylaw. So with that, we want to protect natural resources from the impacts of development within the current floodplain and allowing for regulation of the future floodplain with relation to sea level rise. Then we have the coastal resiliency regulations that supports that coastal resiliency bylaw. So these first 2 products are Wetlands Conservation Commission products. And so those are performance standards that help to support that bylaw and give towns a little more guidance on how to actually get to the goal of what you've put into the bylaw. And again, that also allows you to regulate the current floodplain, which is land subject to coastal storm flowage for conservation commissions, and again, areas likely to be vulnerable in the future with sea level rise. And then our third product is the zoning flood resiliency bylaw. So this is with zoning. It also is going to affect our building folks as well. So I'm glad we've got some building folks with us. So this exceeds the minimum requirements. All of your towns, I've worked with all of your towns to have the basic minimum required floodplain bylaw in your zoning. You're all set with that. Now these go above and beyond those minimum requirements to tie into what we've done with the wetlands bylaw and regulations, and also to pull out some of the things that I've heard from building commissioners over the last 10 years that are issues with the building code, that towns need more guidance at the local level. We're not violating anything. We're not going above and beyond the building code there. They are just having more clarity at the local level on some of those things. So it'll help bring more clarity to everyone in enforcing some pieces of the building code as well. So we've mentioned future flooding several times with sea level rise. So what we are using, in the bylaw, we've built in the best available data. So you do not have to use this model. However, right now, this is the best available data. The Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model was developed for the state of Massachusetts. It is a statewide product. We have adapted it for the Cape and worked with Woods Hole Group, who developed it, to make sure that we are using it appropriately at the parcel and residential level. So the model indicates the likelihood of future flooding in 2050 and 2070. We've looked specifically at the 1% chance storm. That's what we regulate already for FEMA. FEMA regulates the 1% chance storm, so that is what we are going to continue to do. There are other probabilities built into this model, but we're going to keep it consistent with what FEMA already says. So this model uses sea level rise projections, historic and modeled storm data, landscape. There's a lot of data that goes into this. And it provides flood extent and heights and a lot of other outputs. There's a lot in this model. We have simplified it to make it as easy as possible and user-friendly as possible for you folks to use. And we've also built a viewer for it, which we'll just mention at the end. It will make all of this a lot easier. So some background. So the goal of the bylaws and regulations is to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the risk of environmental damage, loss of natural resources, human suffering, and the loss of life and property resulting from storms, flooding, erosion, and continuing sea level rise by promoting greater resiliency within areas subject to coastal flooding currently and as sea levels rise. So that's the foundation there. So as Heather mentioned, DEP has issued draft performance standards for projects within land subject to coastal storm flowage, LSCSF. Date of final promulgation is unknown. As Heather mentioned, there are suggestions it might be soon, but we want to proceed, and we have built a lot of what we know that will be in those into this already, so that it'll be consistent. And yeah, we don't want to wait. There's a smirk over on the other side of the table there. there's some lack of faith that they will actually be promulgated soon. So towns may also need additional mechanisms to address current and future flood climate risks than what we have within those DEP standards. We don't know what will ultimately come out in those standards. So our model bylaw and model regulations provide options for additional performance standards within LSCSF beyond what DEP will promulgate, also beyond what we have now, which is mostly nothing for most of our towns. And then expanding jurisdiction beyond LSCSF, and then also adapting the new standards to local needs. So there's a lot, this is kind of an a la carte process. At some point we will go through all of the regulations with each of your boards in detail, and you decide which ones are appropriate for your town and if you want to adapt any of those regulations for your town. So the bylaws and regulations do include performance standards for work within LSCSF, and then we also have a coastal resilience zone, which we're going to show you in a minute. We're going to show you a graphical depiction of what all these zones are. The coastal resilience zone is the whole zone with where we have current jurisdiction, land subject to coastal storm flowage, as well as those areas where sea level rise will pull new areas into the floodplain. So that whole area is our coastal resilience zone. So we have an option to expand the regulatory jurisdiction beyond what we have now. So horizontally and vertically. I'm going to pause on that because this is a little bit of a tricky concept to understand. So when we say we're going to expand jurisdiction horizontally, that's relatively easy to understand. If right now the floodplain ends at Charlene, if you want to raise your hand, there we go. What we're saying is with sea level rise, we're seeing that we're expecting the horizontal extent of the floodplain to expand. So let's say it goes back to Amy. So there's our horizontal expansion. Vertically, we're saying, okay, right now we expect the flooding to be at about the height of this left turn. With sea level rise, we expect it to be higher, so it'll be about at my shoulders. So does everybody understand that that's what we mean by vertical and horizontal? Okay, great. I presented this to a group of floodplain managers at a national conference, and they were all kind of like, say that again? So, so that's why I go through that exercise. Okay. So we're using the 1% annual chance storm based on the best available coastal flooding model. Again, right now, that is the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, but we wrote it that way on purpose in case better data becomes available. And then the boards will choose if you want to use 2050 or 2070 for those sea level rise projections. And then we also have special transition areas that are in there for the migration of wetlands resources with sea level rise. Then we also have the design flood elevation, so that's the horizontal piece, and then the design flood elevation is the predicted elevation of water resulting from sea level rise and coastal storms, so that's the vertical piece of increasing what we expect to see now. So towns can adapt, again, you can all adapt these standards to your local needs. We're not going to give it to you and say, here you go, no discussion, just adopt it. We want to go through each and every piece of it with you to make sure it works for you. So with that flexibility, again, we can modify and adapt as scientific modeling evolves. And then what we want to do, this is going to get a little bit tricky to follow this. So the bylaw, we use the bylaw to establish the authority to regulate the floodplain, and then we use the regulations for detailed provisions that are likely to change over time. So we're hoping we only have to change the bylaw once, and then the regulations may have to change a few times. So for folks who are on conservation commissions or staff to conservation commissions, what we are recommending is that you adopt the regulations for the horizontal extent and vertical extent that you have right now. So you have jurisdiction over LSCSF, land subject to coastal storm flowage. And then you have the authority to do that now. You can adopt those regulations because you already have that jurisdiction. So we recommend going that route. In most of your towns, your regulations only have to go through your conservation commissions. I understand Orleans is a little bit different. But it will be easier. There's more easier discussion and discussion that you can actually have that can't be had on the floor of town meeting to have those regulations adopted by the conservation commissions. And then the bylaw does need to go to town meeting, but a lot of what's in that, you'll be able to say you're already regulating LSCSF in this way. So the bylaw will be a little bit easier to put before town meeting if you go in that order. And this also presumes that local wetlands bylaws already include basic elements, the purpose, authority, procedures, definitions, and those performance standards, including floodplains, which we believe that you do. Okay, so this is the graphical depiction of the different zones. So we're going to get a little more into detail about what some of these regulations are that we're proposing. And we need you to understand the different zones in order to do that. So what we have here is a graphic of FEMA floodplains. So to the left, we have the V zone, which is the velocity zone. This is the area where we expect wave heights to be greater than 3 feet. Just inland of that, we have what's called the coastal A zone, or the Wetlands Protection Act calls it the moderate wave action zone. Could FEMA and the Building Code and the Wetlands Protection Act all use the same language? That'd be really great, but they don't. So we have a coastal A zone. It is the same thing as the MOA, or moderate wave action zone. And that's where we expect waves to be between 1.5 and 3 feet. This is a new zone. This just became effective. We are just regulating this as in the Building Code as of July. So this is a new zone. It's been on our maps, but there have been no regulations tied to it. Now the Building Code is regulating to it. But it's new. And then inland of that, we have regular A zones. Could we also use different letters or letters that mean anything? That would also be helpful, but that's not where we are. So A zone, it just means no waves. And then in the Wetlands Protection Act, that is the minimum wave action zone. There is no wave action there. And then we have this other zone over here in the pink here. That's our future flood zone. That extends beyond. That's the horizontal expansion into areas where the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model tells us we will have flood risk in the 1% chance storm in 2050 or 2070 with sea level rise. And that's outside of our current flood zones. So what we've done, we've set up the regulations so that they apply to each zone, and they are more restrictive the more risky the zone is. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Logical? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, so we have some general performance standards that apply to the whole zone. We've got standards for the V zone. We have standards for the coastal A zone, standards for the regular A zone. Then we also have these special transition areas and redevelopment sites. So I mentioned earlier, special transition areas are where we expect to have wetland resources need to migrate with sea level rise. And then redevelopment sites are areas that are already very heavily developed. And you can decide in your community, do you have any development or areas that would fall into redevelopment sites? And there are some slightly different regulations for those areas. So we're going to just do a summary. Again, this is not all of it. We're not going into all of the details, but we just want to give you a flavor of what's coming, what we'll want to talk to you about. So this is a summary of the standards for wetlands and zoning. So these are the standards that are in both bylaws, both wetlands and zoning. Limitations and prohibitions on development by flood zone. No new development in the V and coastal A zone. Town of Chatham passed decades ago, no new development in the V zone and no new dwellings in the A zone. So we have a great standard for that already in Chatham, and it withstood a test in court decades ago as well, and was withheld or upheld. Also, DEP is proposing the same thing. No structural expansion in V and coastal A. If you're not allowed to have any new development, then why would you allow massive expansion? Also, limits on fill and engineering analyses required if fill is going to be used. Some towns are experiencing a lot of fill development pressure. One town that's here right now, one town that is not. And this will help address that issue. Sometimes fill can be the right thing, but in most situations it is not. Also, no redirecting or channelizing floodwaters or increasing elevation or velocity, and any project must restore natural features where possible. We've seen, especially with fill and more development, we've seen more of this happening. We want to make sure that it doesn't keep happening into the future and endangering folks on either side of projects that are happening in the floodplain. Also, a prohibition on storage of hazardous materials. If we have a flood and hazardous materials get into the water, then we have massive issues with our resource areas. And then also no rebuilding after 2 substantial damage determinations. This one will cause a little controversy. We will have to talk about whether or not you want to keep that. Basically what that means, substantial damage is a special term defined by the National Flood Insurance Program. It's built into the building code. What it means is if you meet that substantial damage determination, which is if it's going to take 50% or more of the market value of your structure to bring the structure up to code after it's been damaged, then it has to be brought up to code. If it's 30%, you don't have to bring it up to code. You can rebuild it where it is. And I keep doing this up to code because normally that means elevating the structure. So that means that if you are substantially damaged once, you've been brought up to code. If you are substantially damaged again and your to-code structure has been damaged by a coastal storm, we've built that in too, then that area is likely too hazardous to continue to build there. Some of our attorneys that we've worked with think this is a great idea, some don't. So I think it's less of a great idea. So again, these are the kinds of things that we will work individually with your towns to see if this is something that you would like to incorporate. So summary of standards that are either in wetlands or zoning. So the blue on the top here, wetlands only. Elevation of substantial improvements or raise and replace projects or new construction must use the best available flood and sea level rise data. So that means that we are suggesting that the elevation, the vertical elevation coming from the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model be used, or the building code, whichever is higher. Some of you are saying, wait, we're not allowed to have standards at the local level that are stricter than the building code. That is correct. What we are doing is regulating the operation or the function of the floodplain and the floodwaters underneath the structure, and therefore saying it has to be high enough to allow the floodwaters to move, allow that floodplain to function. I did have an opportunity to speak with folks from the Attorney General's office about this, and what they said was, we don't look at conservation, we don't look at wetlands bylaws. And they left it at that. So they said that would not fly in zoning, but they said we do not look at wetlands bylaws. And the attorney that we worked with was very solid on, no, we are regulating the function of the floodplain with the wetlands, putting this in wetlands because we're not telling anyone how to build, we are regulating the function of the floodplain. So that's the one that's only in wetlands. And then in zoning, we have some things that are more closely tied to the building department. Again, this is based on 10 years of back and forth with building commissioners. And this is planning as well. Building height baseline measured from design flood elevations. Some towns love, some towns hate this. Some of you have already dabbled in this as well. So your height is measured from where the house has to be elevated to per these codes rather than from the ground, so that you're not kind of squishing the houses. Also then clarifications of and closing of loopholes from the building code. So using letters of map revision based on fill to enable a basement. Some of you have no idea what that means. Some of you are far too familiar with what that means. Just trust me that your building commissioners would like this to be cleared up. How to handle qualifying historic structures, that's something we can go into more detail, but that's also come up in many towns. Non-conversion agreements, how you use the space underneath an elevated structure, using an assessed value for substantial improvement and substantial damage rather than allowing people to use appraisals, because then you've got folks who can afford appraisals using them and then inflating the prices of their structures. And again, for some folks, if you aren't steeped in the building world, this doesn't make as much sense to you, but we'll walk you through the details when we meet with you, with your boards individually. And then also addressing accessory structures like sheds. If we don't do anything with our sheds, then why are we regulating our buildings or other buildings so much if our sheds can just be floating around? So addressing that as well. Okay, so has anyone adopted these yet? So we've been in conversations with staff and board members in 9 Cape Cod towns, Nantucket, and 4 towns on Martha's Vineyard. What we have run into with some of the bylaw pieces is town meeting time restrictions. Of course, we know that town meeting only happens once or twice a year. So with the bylaw adoptions, we're running into, oh no, we started this process in whatever month, so we don't have time. And now we also, again, we're recommending starting with the regulations first. Some towns want to proceed with the bylaw anyway, but because of the timing of town meeting, no one has adopted a full bylaw at this point. But I do want to note, so Chatham, I mentioned earlier, folks from Chatham, you do have a fantastic bylaw that is more restrictive in terms of what can be developed in your floodplain already that you've had since the early 90s. Yarmouth Conservation Commission, and then town meeting did adopt a part of the bylaw, just a part of the bylaw that unfortunately has now been superseded by the building code, so they're going to have to go back and do it again. But we've corrected that. But they did adopt part of it. Mashpee has also been working on incorporating parts of our regulations into their regulations, and then Provincetown has a updated floodplain zoning bylaw on the warrant for this spring town meeting that took parts of this bylaw as well. And then just to note some of the things that we did pull in from DEP, because again, as myself, as if I cover my county logo here and put on my conservation commissioner hat, I also am thinking, well, do we want to move ahead with this if we're just about to get DEP regulations? We don't want to make this a really messy process. So we have, as much as we possibly can, incorporated the two together. So again, that prohibition on development in the V zones, that came straight from DEP, not channeling floodwaters or overall worsening flood conditions for neighbors, using climate forward data, and elevating above building code standards came directly from DEP as well. And then just to wrap up, the resources that we have. So we have all of these resources available on this website, the Cape Cod Commission's website. All 3 of these products are there. And we also have communications toolkits that cover how to get the word out and how, for your boards, when you are actually working on adopting these, how to do that. And then I also mentioned that we have a viewer. So we have a data viewer that shows the current FEMA floodplain and the future floodplain. That's the future floodplain there, the structures that are pulled into each. And then we also have part of the viewer that, that shows the elevations and compares elevations from the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model to elevations required by the building code, because we cannot tell anybody to elevate lower than the building code. So we have those compared too. So it's easy to just go see, put in an address and go see, okay, which is the recommended elevation here. So we have that as well. And then we also have, the Pleasant Bay Alliance also has a website for this project specifically. So with that, I think all of us can take any clarifying questions before I pass it back to Heather or Catherine or something. Any clarifying questions? Oh, we've got to, all the way in the back, hand first, yeah.
There's a microphone right here, sir.
We're recording for folks who weren't able to make it, so.
In terms of channelizing flood flows, would a structure like a barrier be considered one of those?
Yes, yep, exactly, yep. Anything that could redirect floodwaters would be incorporated into that. Go ahead.
Yeah, just about the sea level rise predictions. You're using the Woods Hole Version Center for Coastal Studies also has a model. I'm curious about why the choice was made that way. Maybe it's just the organizations involved, but I'm also concerned about whether they're consistent with each other and whether in the future, when there are controversial decisions being made, If they're not consistent with each other, it could be problematic. I'm just wondering what you have to say about that.
Great point, and feel free to jump in. So the reason that we went with the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model is because the state is already using it for regulatory purposes, so we wanted to be consistent with what the state is already requiring. And in terms of whether there might be differences, there probably will be. All models are models. They are imperfect. They are just doing the best that they can, but they have different inputs, so there probably will be differences. If in your community you decide that you would rather use the Center for Coastal Studies model, then you have the right to decide that. We can do a closer look into the two models and see how they compare. What I would recommend is looking at the two models specifically in your town and seeing how they compare and if one is really drastically different from the other, and we can help with that. Anything to add? Any other questions before we move on? All right.
All right, well, Shannon covered a lot of information, so could also imagine people sort of processing and maybe being shy about asking questions like, what the heck did you mean about that? So as you sift through the information you're hearing and questions come up, please just don't be shy. So we wanted to just sort of make a recommendation here about the process going forward. When we developed these models that Shannon has just reviewed, we were working with a few towns specifically to address their interests and needs. So we feel like the models were developed directly with community input. And I think we thought, oh, well, in a perfect world, you will go to town meeting and authorize your Conservation Commission through the adoption of a wetlands bylaw to regulate a future floodplain area. And then, after town meeting has taken that action, then the Conservation Commission logically adopts regulations that support that bylaw and that new authority that they have. I think what we're hearing as we've been working in the community is that that's a little bit complicated. There's a lot of work associated with convincing town meeting that there are good reasons for regulating not just the current floodplain, but a future floodplain. So our recommendation to you here is to consider moving forward first with each Conservation Commission adopting a version of the model wetlands regulations, something that, aside from Orleans, you can do by a vote, have a public hearing, public process within the Conservation Commission, normal sort of meeting and hearing process. Adopt a set of those regulations that address just regulating existing development within the existing floodplain, or it would address new development within the existing floodplain. Sorry, that's confusing. Then working toward developing a bylaw that would enable a future floodplain to be regulated. Work on that simultaneously, but for a future town meeting. And what we're putting out there for your consideration is that might be spring 2027, so a year and some from now. After we've had an opportunity to educate the community about what this work is about, why it's important, and that you've already had the regulations on your books and you've been applying them for some time. And then I think hopefully you can have understood from Shannon's presentation that these bylaws were all developed to work together. So we then recommend that the planning board also consider adopting these higher standards through a new zoning bylaw that would enable planning board to regulate in a way that's consistent with how the Conservation Commission will be regulating. So depending on, you all know your own towns and what makes the most sense, but our recommendation to you is that you consider adopting basic wetlands floodplain regulations to start, work toward adopting a wetlands bylaw at town meeting that would enable you to regulate a future floodplain area, and then work concurrently on zoning bylaw higher standards. I guess just a couple of things also, as Shannon, I think, very ably described, these are set up with sort of menus of options, so you can select the degree to which you want to regulate an area that makes sense within your community. So just noting that the types of allowable development in each of those coastal subzones that she described could really vary and likely should vary. V zones being the most hazardous and areas where our recommendation is that there should be no new additional development happening. How you want to handle historic structures. Cape Cod really is defined by our historic structures, our historic town centers. There may be good reasons for treating historic structures a little bit differently than you might treat everything else. But that, I think, is also a conversation to be had town by town. And then, this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but how to define what is a substantial improvement. Different towns may want to take different approaches on that as well. So with all of that sort of thrown out at you, I guess we're now going to transition to hearing from you what your thoughts are on all of this. Does this seem something that you're excited to take on? And if yes, what do you need from us to help facilitate those conversations within your communities? A timeline slide too, which maybe is helpful to just review before actually I set you loose on that. So this SNEP Network Technical Assistance Award provides basically a small amount of funding for Cape Cod Commission staff and Cooperative Extension staff to do things like this, present this information, answer your questions, come to your board meetings and sort of work through some of the nitty-gritty, go back to our office, draft some stuff up. But we want to, continue to work with you beyond sort of the limits of that technical assistance award. So the award takes us technically through the end of September of this year. And we hope to have drafted model wetlands regulations for the towns with sort of ongoing coordination with your boards over the next 8 or so months. During that time, we hope to also develop a model wetlands bylaw for the towns to consider adopting in the spring. I'm not sure that will necessarily be in its final form by September, but we'll continue to work with you as time continues. And so the next step really here is after this meeting, we hope to answer your questions at this sort of high level, and then we'll be scheduling meetings with the different conservation commissions as a starting point to get into more specific conversations about the elements of the model bylaw that you would like to see incorporated. And we'd be happy to do that with planning boards as well, if planning boards are interested in taking this on. So, yeah, okay. So with that, thoughts? Yes.
This is great, and it's so important. But in Orleans, and maybe other communities, I think the information has to get to the public so they can see what's going on, and getting the information into their mind and thinking about what they have to pass at town meeting. So I think it's imperative that your organizations and working with the town and getting public meetings with the town to get the public out and see all this so that they can actually vote on it.
And building off of that, I've run it by some of the engineers that I work with to make sure they're not gonna go, whoa, we don't like this, we're gonna fight this. To be fair, the engineers that I work with are the ones who are trying to follow the rules, and so they're reaching out and making sure that they're following it. So there probably will still be some other folks who have not reached out because they're not necessarily always trying to follow the letter of the law. Yep. But I have run it by some engineers as well, and so that's part of it, because it's going to be the private sector consultants who are really going to understand this and could push back on some of it. But yes, so that's part of it.
And I think this is an area too where perhaps the Alliance can provide some support. And I think our thinking is that a regional approach might be beneficial from a public engagement, public informational standpoint, because it's not just one commission or one planning board taking this on, but we have a regional strategy and a regional rationale, and can compile resources to communicate information more effectively. So we look forward to working with you, each of the commissions and boards, on this, and appreciate the resources and the frameworks that the commission's already started to think about and put together that we can use as a starting point and adapt those to get information out to all the various stakeholders, property owners, engineers, and town meeting participants.
Can I ask just a very basic housekeeping question? Is there somewhere that the slide deck from today is available? Is there a platform where we can access that, or?
So I think what we can do is, after this meeting, and please, if you haven't, please sign in with your email address. We can send links to you. Shannon went through the different web-based resources. We just added a page to the Pleasant Bay Alliance website that is devoted to this effort. And we'll have a link to this meeting. Once the recording of this meeting, we'll have all of the resources that were listed, including the presentation materials. So, and we want to keep that current so you can refer back to it. It also has contact information for these experts, and it'll be an ongoing resource.
Great, fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, I agree that this is very important work and that we in Harwich need to get engaged with this. And I don't know, we haven't had any discussion about that, but I think we would need to, in the pretty near future, have a conversation that involves the whole commission, specifically about the regulatory changes. And then there's going to be another step from there to coming up potentially with draft changes to regulations. And I think, this timeline is not very long, and I think it's critical. I mean, yes, we need to convince the public that this is a good idea, but it's a smaller segment of the public for the first step, starting with the commission itself, and getting some agreement on the commission. So I think we need to look in Harwich for some time on our agenda, which is typically busy anyway, to have a conversation with you all to bring the full commission up to speed and make some more specific plans about where to go. Thank you.
If I take off my county hat for a second again, cover my logo here, put on my Dennis Conservation Commission hat, the Dennis Conservation Commission has started that process, and we did a work session, and I just walked through all of the regulations and explained what each one really meant. And then as a commission, we decided, do we want this in Dennis or do we not? And most of them we did, but there were a few that the other commissioners said, nope, this might not quite fit in Dennis, or we want to understand this a little bit better. So so that's how Dennis did it. And we've had the opportunity to meet with a couple of other conservation commissions as well, who are taking a similar approach. If a work session is an option, because walking through each of the regulations does take some time, and if you already have a long meeting, that sounds exhausting. But yes, we do need to start doing that.
Yep. Yeah, I think that if you think about the process, what we're going to be needing is the technical support in terms of the Conservation Commission identifying the regulations that we think are appropriate at this time. And since they are drafted already, basically, and already aligned with DEP, it's very helpful to have that, to be able to say that this is what DEP is going to be requiring anyway. So, and it gives you the opportunity to begin to implement some of these changes before you expand jurisdiction, because we all know that that expansion is where you're going to run into opposition, and that will happen at town meetings. So that's the second place we're going to need help, is in, I mean, it may be, I know I've heard this from other people, that it could be, depending on each town's wetlands bylaw, a fairly simple matter on the town meeting side to simply authorize the Conservation Commission to create this coastal resilience zone. But even with that, you're still going to need a really robust outreach effort, because it's not just the engineers, it's going to be the developers, it's going to be the property owners. Word, goes down the line all the time, whether it's correct or not. So we really need to be out in front in terms of engaging the community on why this is happening and why it's in the community's interest to make sure that this goes forward and we don't get surprised at town meeting. So that's a huge area where I know that, speaking for this Conservation Commission, we need help, is in developing the materials and helping us get the word out and do so in a smart, strategic way that goes step by step.
So, great. So to this question, what more do you feel you need? Carol indicated that if you've signed in, please everyone sign in. We'll be sure to share with everyone here links to the various web resources, Commission site, Pleasant Bay Alliance site, where Carol is going to be stashing all of the materials that are generated through this specific process. And I guess we could make a point of pointing out this communications framework that was developed as part of, at the same time that we developed these model regulations. Take a look at that and see whether it's useful. I mean, I think at the time we felt it was useful, but is there, are there, does it have what you need in order to make the case within your communities, or is there something else that you might need? Because I think there is some capacity to, develop additional materials, aside from, I'm thinking like social media posts. I'm not a social media person, but, like that kind of thing, we can help generate those kinds of
even
things.
simple things like a one-page brochure that we can hand out to people, even
Right.
at the upcoming town meeting, about what to think about in the future. Basic information, slide decks, because we'll be out there having to hold, workshops and information sessions for people. So materials, you guys make the most beautiful graphics. So things that would help us in being able to communicate that, because if we had to do it ourselves, it would probably be a mess.
How's it been going in P-Town? Like, has there been a lot of community pushback against potential bylaws? Sorry, the question was how it's going in Provincetown with their potential bylaws change, which is coming up this spring, so that seems to be the most rapid one coming.
Yep, so we haven't been heavily involved in that because they, as such a developed floodplain community, they are taking a slightly different approach than what we've put together. Again, they pulled in pieces of it, but they also have a coastal resilience plan, and the town, everyone in town, at least who's there year-round, understands the flooding. It happens all the time. They see it all the time. So because of that, there hasn't been much pushback, and I don't believe they're expecting much pushback because of that. There are a couple of provisions in there that are not in ours, we probably won't see anywhere else, about seawall height. That may or may not be controversial, but that piece is not something that we're recommending in ours, and I think that's the piece that's likely to be controversial. Everything else should be pretty straightforward. But again, because of their experience with very frequent flooding, that makes it a little bit easier, whereas all of the towns represented here, we have a lot of folks who live outside the floodplain and don't see flooding all the time, so it'll be a slightly different approach. That was simultaneous.
Go ahead, Susan. Quick question, a little bit random. Since I've owned my home for so many years now, what is the current seller disclosure? Like if someone's buying a home, do they know which floodplain they're in and potentially could change? And are the realtors educated enough that they're not promising, oh yeah, you can make all these changes?
So, Massachusetts does not have a real estate disclosure law, but the state is working on it. It is currently in progress. So right now, what happens if you have a mortgage, you find out at closing if your home is in a floodplain, and therefore if you have a federally backed mortgage, you're required to purchase flood insurance. That's how you find out. The realtors, so we have done some work with the Cape and Islands Association of Realtors. So if anybody has a connection there, the people I'm connecting with keep leaving. So I need a new one if anyone has one. But we have done some education with the realtors as well. They actually have a Cape and Islands specific certification that has, we built presentations for them on flooding so that they understand that. And when I was working with realtors, they said part of their code of ethics, if they are a realtor rather than a real estate agent, is that if they know, they have to disclose. And on Cape Cod, they really ought to know. But it is possible that someone might not find out until they get to closing. Amy.
Just an idea as we get farther along in the planning process in terms of getting information out to the public. What's handy is these are the Pleasant Bay Alliance towns, and those towns are all covered by the Cape Cod Chronicle. So kind of basic information out to the public that directs people to talk directly to each of the towns. May garner some other comments too, but another way we can say, hey, we tried to get it out to you, and it's not everybody, watches Conservation Commission meetings, and I know. Be surprised how many do. But just another thing, another PR thing as we get closer, is a joint piece for the Chronicle.
And we do, I'll just point out, we have Michelle White back there taking notes for us, so. And Heather's writing things.
So you haven't mentioned anything about the infrastructure other than the house. I'm wondering about the septic systems and roads. I mean, I'm on the planning committee. The only thing we can do is the driveway. I mean, how do we coordinate so there's one set of regulations that are considered by everybody, as opposed to, well, you come to us for the driveway and there you can get a loophole around a few other things by that. And then the septic systems, that particularly the existing ones, and that may be inundated in that Is there anything we're doing about that as well with it in this?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so the idea with these 3 sets of regulations is that they are coordinated, they are consistent, and provided that you're selecting comparable elements within each, Conscom and Planning Board will be regulating similarly, and hopefully there won't be runarounds, you know, well, I went to this board and they said this was fine. The idea is that you will be regulating consistently across those boards. The provisions do regulate septic systems, right?
Tiny bit, not much. And same thing with infrastructure, they do touch on. We wanted to make sure that we weren't limiting what towns could do in terms of protecting infrastructure. So we took a look at that in some very specific legal ways of looking at that. And with the septic systems, there is actually not a ton of science on what is happening and how we deal with that. So we are working with the Barnstable County Massachusetts Septic Test Center to look into that. We've talked about how to figure out funding to run some tests on that and what to do with that. And then we've also worked with, there are some researchers at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, so with the Sea Grant connections there, we've been able to talk with them as well, but they're still trying to get funding to do the research on it. So we don't want to suggest any regulations before, we don't want to get ahead of the science on that. We are aware that it is a problem, but we want more information before we can really dive into that. Do you have anything else you want to?
No, I'm gonna
Okay.
look into that though in more
Okay.
detail. Yeah. George.
There's a couple things come to mind here. One is, I think, we're talking about taking new jurisdiction areas that are upland, that are outside a resource area presently, and whether they're developed or not developed, there's a lot of value there, and I think we need to, I could use the help having an ironclad, local, definitive reason why we have to do this. I think the first slide was great, but we're all in the echo chamber here. We all kind of agree and know the background, so that would be helpful. For Orleans, I'd like to have the GIS layers of those future areas so that we can count up the number of structures that are there now. And yeah, I think just understanding the specific local problems that we're trying to address, because I can just see the development community looking at this and saying, you're looking at land outside your jurisdiction now. Some of it has a view of the water. It's pretty desirable land. So if we wanted to have more regulation on it, we need a very good governmental reason to do so. That's it.
And we have that GIS data all available, and any town can either look at it on the viewer that's built, or we can give it to you to do, yeah. Yep. Mhm. There's one over here.
I think he sort of answered my question, but as far as you had some numbers of how many people are in the flood range and maybe in the future. How easily is that obtained?
Yeah, actually, we have those numbers as well.
For each town?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can. I didn't want to throw a gazillion numbers at you, but so the same information that George Meservey, town planner in Orleans, has asked for, we can provide to any town that's interested. We've calculated what I presented, the number of structures and parcels and assessed value within the current floodplain. We can also do that for the future floodplain as defined by the MCFRM. So in Harwich, it goes up a lot. It's kind of dramatic, but it goes up in each community considerably.
The reason for this is I think these people really have to know first what's going to happen to their property, and then they can relay it to maybe the town saying, look, this is what's happening, and could be a more convincing
Right.
discussion for town meeting.
Right.
think one thing to add to that too, the value does increase, but those areas where we're recommending expanding your jurisdiction are not actually huge. They're bigger in some areas than in others, but in some areas I was surprised by how small the increase was. So I think that could be, and we can figure out, how many more acres are being brought into that, and the value in all of those numbers. Because if it's not that big, that's also something that's important to make sure people do understand.
Right.
Yeah.
Understood. Thank you.
Yes, in any of our towns, I think it's only a minority of the voters who are immediately affected by coastal flooding. So for me, if you want to try and get the public, i.e. all voters, behind sophisticated, technical, important changes, it would be extraordinarily helpful if you can reduce the issue to a metric which affects all voters, which is cost or damage. So if there were a way to provide guidance to the towns as to what the cost, both to municipal repairs and private property owners, the cost or the damage if you do nothing, would it seem to me to be something which all voters can get behind, because if they do nothing, they have to foot the bill to repair all of the municipal structures. And that gets everybody's attention in a hurry, whether you're a coastal, whether you're subject to coastal flow damage or not.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I know some towns already have quick numbers for, okay, this road goes out all the time, this is how much it costs DPW to fix it every time. But yeah, I think that's something that we can look to town staff to help us get those numbers. Yeah, that's a great point.
I think you guys did an analysis.
The cost of doing nothing?
Oh, no.
No, it was a whole economic analysis of coastal flooding, or
It was, the cost of
Climate
doing
change.
nothing was, it was broader than just flooding. But yeah, we could dig into that report and see if there are things we can extract.
2021. It was great.
Greg is, and then Janet.
Sorry, just hiding behind you here, Janet. Okay. So I think this is a great example of some of the support that our regional agencies and county can help us with. I have the same concerns as George mentioned about providing outreach, finding out the financial impacts to the town and property owners, specifically that, expanded jurisdiction. Before we go to town meeting, actually having GIS maps, perhaps having an interactive map on our website, especially during direct public session, stakeholder input. If we have a large area that's expanding, we may reach out to them specifically to encourage them to show up to these public meetings so they're not surprised afterwards. So, that kind of support provided by SNP funding in the county, I think is going to be invaluable moving forward. And then, as they come to each one of our individual communities, I think we're going to be, tapping them for different things. I know through our Energy and Climate Action Committee, we've been doing a lot of analysis of our salt marshes and potential migration pathways. I think I'd really like to see that tied into our special transition areas. That may work differently for each town. But, the next step is going to be a lot of public outreach.
Great.
Janet?
Just following up on what Greg just said and what George had said earlier. So there's two different kinds of properties to think about. One are the ones who will be brought into jurisdiction by the expansion. And Shannon's right. I saw some of the maps and said, oh my God, it's hardly anything. So that's good. Then there's also the special transition zones. And I think that's just in the bylaw, right? That's not something that the conservation commissions will do by regulation before the bylaw, because it is an expansion of jurisdiction. So as Greg said, Chatham's Energy and Climate Committee has been doing a lot of in-depth analysis, and funded a lot by CPC, so think about that in other towns. They've got the funding. They work with the Center for Coastal Studies. They've identified the town's marshes. They are identifying the likely migration routes of those marshes, and they've now got to the point where they've been able to identify particular parcels of property that are in that expected migration route. So those properties are also going to be brought into jurisdiction by this and regulated pretty significantly, because they won't be allowed to expand or add any hardscape or other kinds of things. So that's kind of another technical area that could be a real surprise. So I'm really grateful that the town's energy committee has been digging into this and has this data. It'll be very helpful down the line, and it's something that reach out to Chatham's Energy and Climate Committee if you have questions about how they've been doing it. And these two here, it's going to be a very, very, very significant part of all of this.
Thanks, Janet. And that brings up a really important point of you're all doing this. We want everyone to do this together, and we can help facilitate also communication between the towns, but we want to make sure we learn from what everyone else is doing.
I also think it's important that as planning board members, we know what the Conservation Commission is doing. The Conservation Commission knows what the planning board's doing. So I do think some sort of initial workshop to understand what our goal is and, where we need to go to, that we're all on board together, that we all understand what our roles are, what our responsibilities are, and how we can help each other. I mean, how many times does a planning board member get up and support a conservation commission and vice versa? It doesn't happen very often, but here's an opportunity for us to work together to come to a really good, because you all know me and have known me for a long time. I am a flood geek and I'm a zoning geek, so I'm actually really excited about all this.
Love it, Charlene.
Yeah, can you say anything about where the resistance is coming from that's slowing up promulgation of the state regulations and how that, and I'm sorry, I'm completely ignorant of this. Apparently some other people have some idea, but how that, what I'm concerned about is how that might be reflected in specific kinds of resistance we find locally.
Wild guess, development community. I mean, property owners that will be affected by feeling, just worrying about what that regulation might do to their ability to develop their property value.
But we don't actually know that.
Yeah.
We don't know what's causing.
We don't know.
We don't know.
I can share that I asked Dot McGlinchey at MACC, because I said to her, we wrote a letter of support for MACC, and I got a letter back from DEP saying, thank you so much for supporting DEP through this. And I had been, our letter said, let's get these regulations promulgated ASAP. And I thought, well, that's funny that DEP is thanking us for supporting that. So I said to Dot, I'm getting the sense that it's not DEP that's holding up this promulgation. And she said, I can't really talk about it, but you're 100% right. So it seems like it's political behind the scenes, not a big surprise, but it is not DEP that's dragging its feet. It's something else happening in the background, I think.
Yeah, Janet, I think you're right. I don't remember the details, but yes, something to that effect, that it actually might not have anything to do with things that could impact how things happen at the local level. It might be something just internal to the state.
Thank you.
So it always occurs to me that we're worried about property values going down. That's already happened. It's the realization that their property value is going down that we're creating for them. And that's going to be very hard to communicate, but that's the reality. We're not creating a lower property value for them. That's the reality of where they're living, and we're just trying to, cope with not making it worse than it already is. So I really think we need to make sure we address that.
No, right now. More on that coming later.
Yeah.
So I think in doing with the public, advising them and such, I would bet anything that when they hear this, of maybe stopping or some of the improvement areas and such as developers, I bet the building department will get plummeted with building permits and such. So I think the quicker we do this, the better off everybody will be.
Yeah, that's a great point. There is a regional tool for that, which I'm not sure I'm necessarily going to recommend, but there's something called a District of Critical Planning Concern tool that does allow the community to place a temporary moratorium on development, so those pulling of permits, while new regulations are put in place.
I think another thing that towns can rely on to help get through this is the town comprehensive plans. I know Orleans certainly puts an emphasis on natural resources and environment and keeping our blue community blue and all of that. So, and there were the process of getting that plan together was very comprehensive. The public was involved all the way through it. There were questionnaires, and Sarah can talk about it, but we solicited feedback all along the way. So it's another way for to support this effort going to town meetings. It's like you voted for this in the town comprehensive plan. Ours is coming up in the spring town meeting, but I imagine it'll pass.
Yeah, thanks, Drucy. And I think that's a good example in, the Energy and Climate Action Committee in Chatham, and all of the towns have similar committees. I mean, we really need to think through with you those networks and those different voices and people who are working maybe from a different angle on similar issues, and that's how we build a coalition of support.
You also have your hazard mitigation plans that some of you are just wrapping up, but that's another avenue that you can use. And then also, all of you participate in what's called the community rating system. So actions that your town takes translates into reduced flood insurance costs for everybody in town. And we designed some of the bylaws around that so that you could reap those flood insurance savings as well. So that is another piece that we can talk about, both financially and as another effort that the town has supported. Great point.
I was going to mention again the economic, I mean, when we talked about how much it was going to cost to do nothing, that woke up the select board, and they started really paying attention and wanted to get involved. So going back to how do you convince your community, if they don't have coastal properties, hey, it's not my problem. It's going to be costing the community in reduced taxes from those wealthy properties, and the need to rebuild our roads.
Yeah, Walter.
I don't really think this is directly in the lane of this particular resiliency effort, but I wondered what your thoughts would be about, I used to help regulate on the Conservation Commission in Orleans, and something we would often see was, we had jurisdiction to 100 foot from the coastal bank. And so that would be preserved and protected and natural. And then you'd have green lawns and deforestation taking place. And so the natural functioning of these watersheds was being adversely impacted. And it's similar, I guess, with marsh migration in terms of paths. How do you think is the best way to regulate for better biodiversity and protection in those highly sensitive areas that are adjacent to the coasts?
Yeah, that's the holy grail, right? I mean, you just sort of encapsulated what I've tried to do for my career. I mean, I think that, so sort of summarize, the The regional policy plan, which is that document that is developed by the Cape Cod Commission and ultimately adopted as an ordinance by the county's Assembly of Delegates, so it becomes the guiding policy document for us here on the Cape and is updated every 5 years. It has fairly strict standards about what happens within coastal within wetland resource areas, and requires undisturbed 100-foot buffers to those resource areas, 350-foot buffers to vernal pools, protection of endangered species habitat, all of that. So the regional policy plan sets these high standards, and as we review, as the Cape Cod Commission reviews developments of regional impact through the regulatory process, they apply those standards, and those standards are fairly effective in protecting those areas where development hasn't already happened. The ideal was that when the Cape Cod Commission Act was passed in 1990, that communities would be adopting regulations that would be in alignment with the regional policy plan, and then regulating that way, so that we would all have these unprotected buffers, protected resource areas. No changes would be happening in these areas. And the reality is that, and as you all know on the front lines, that's a very high bar to meet, especially when there's so much development that's already happened within these resource areas. So as we're moving forward, this particular effort is an opportunity to try to do more to regulate, in this case, our wetland resource areas, to protect them in order to allow them to provide the functions that they do best and that we rely on. And it's an opportunity, as hopefully we're able to adopt these regulations and some changes begin to happen within our resource areas for restoration and the beginning to restore areas for biodiversity and the rest of it. That's all kind of lofty, like, I don't know, ivory tower stuff. But I think that this is the potential for us to move in that direction, step by step. So Greg has some thoughts on this too, maybe?
For an on-the-ground example, I think this particular project is a perfect case of, if you're going to put a buffer on a flood district, it should be vertical, not just a straight 100-foot horizontal. We're actually looking at the vertical sea level rise projections. We're looking at modeled storm surge. So it's not just that blanket 100-foot kind of pulling it out of a hat. There is some justification for that. So, potentially looking at marsh migration, how effectively and rapidly can these marshes migrate? Is it vertical? Is it substrate? Getting into the weeds, seeing how feasible that is for an overall regulatory body, but at least vertically looking at flooding is a step in the right direction.
And I'd just like to maybe put in a plug for the erosion management guidelines that the Alliance generated a few years ago, based on excellent work that Greg did, creating the spectrum of erosion management options. And it's really just a really helpful resource document, and it really focuses on sustaining natural sediment processes in coastal resource areas. And that really is so important, as we all know, to just preserving the sustainability of any number of coastal resource areas. So also available on our website.
So I move we close the Chatham Planning Board meeting.
Second.
You have to take votes.
All in favor?
You have to close.
Okay, do I have a motion to adjourn the planning board meeting?
Made
Oh, you did?
second.
Lauren second. All right, we'll take roll vote.
Aye.
Aye? Aye. Warren? And Art Spurrow, aye. Thank you. And it's, let's see, 11:43.
All right. Thank you all so very much for coming today. Really appreciate it. Look forward to working with you all.
Good.